I want to welcome you for coming. And as you all know, SDIG provides safe, open, and inclusive engagement and awareness generation space. This is a space where we create individuals and groups learning through our posts, shared member stories that are very, sometimes sad, but sometimes very good. We host webinars and discussions on local and international issues, such as the one we're hosting today. So that's essentially what we do. And I want to introduce our moderator today, Dr. Karen Walker. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Dr. Noe. I really appreciate that. I am Dr. Karen Walker, an organizational psychologist, and I've been doing that throughout the federal government, private sector, nonprofit, and academia for quite a while now. I'm also a retired Marine Corps officer. And I have the pleasure today to partner with SDIG and bring you this amazing group of practitioners in the DE&I space, and talking about difficult or navigating difficult conversations in everyday situations. And we get asked a lot of questions from our audience and our membership about, are there any tips and techniques to help us when we're just kind of in our everyday life, right? We go to work, we deal with family, we deal with friends, and we find ourselves in these kind of difficult conversations, and how do we navigate that? So we have with us today two experts, and they are just amazing caliber of individuals. So first we have Frank González. He is the head of diversity and inclusion for MFSG Momentum. And we also have Kristina Smith. Well, before I go to Kristina, I'll give you a moment to read. I'm going a little too fast. Sorry about that, Sedley. I didn't mean to go over your picture so fast, Franks. Everybody should admire Dr. Frank's picture here, and how you can find him on LinkedIn and everything he's been doing. And I'll give him also an opportunity to talk about his accolades. You're getting lots of claps there. And then we have Miss Kristina Smith. She is the CEO and owner of D&I Strategist, and she's also been doing quite a bit of work in diversity, equity, inclusion throughout small businesses, also corporations and nonprofit organizations as well. The way that we'll work this today is I'm going to give us some discussion time with each one of our practitioners, let them talk about their work, some tips and techniques they've found to be helpful, and then we'll go ahead and open it up, before the last about 20 minutes for questions from our audience for how you can apply these skills. So let's start with, so there's some questions about the view, Sedley, if you could check the chat on that. But let's start with Dr. Frank González. If you want to just tell us in about 2 minutes or so, I guess your focus of how you got into this line of work and where your heart is in navigating this space.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Walker. I would say where my heart is I'm a father and I'm a husband. I mean, that shapes the optics of who I am right now, and a very intentional and very supportive and encouraging one, I believe, and I tried to be. But that shapes who I've always been, which is really, I'll just give you a formula, right? We all have lived experiences, and sometimes those lived experiences may cause some barriers, some friction that we're not aware of, or sometimes we are. And my whole philosophy is altruistic mindset of reducing that so that others can have accessibility, mobility, a real opportunity to be able to create something for themselves. And so I get really excited to figure out what that looks like for either groups or individuals.
Oh, I love that. Thank you. The lived experience perspective is so important. Thank you so much. And now, Miss Kristina Smith, if you could do the same for us, give us a little bit of background of yourself and the passion of the work that you're involved in now.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Walker. There were a couple of synchronistic things that happened all at the same time, but one reason that I sort of really moved into this line of work I was having a conversation with my two brothers. I'm the oldest and I have two younger brothers. And we were talking about what happened between the civil rights movement in the 60s. And then we went through this period of time where there didn't seem to be a lot going on in the public eye. We talked about the fact that our parents and a lot of parents of our friends really believed if we got a really good education that we could be successful and that we could turn and help other people do the same thing. And so they invested a lot of time, money, energy into making sure that we were positioned to be successful. And what we found out is that there were so many systemic barriers that are preventing people from moving forward that it doesn't matter how many degrees, as a Black or brown person, it doesn't matter how many degrees you have. It doesn't matter in some cases where you went to school, that those systemic barriers still prevent people, or just racial prejudices prevent people from moving forward. And so I just thought I need to, before I ride off into the sunset, I need to stop and really make sure I'm doing everything I can so that people coming behind me have a better world to live in.
Sure. Thank you so much for bringing that up. And I think it's important that, you mentioned the systemic barriers. And I think for a lot of our, audience and people that may be watching the recording later, for them to be able to understand how those might come into play just for, the everyday kind of person. And I remember when we spoke earlier, Frank, you were saying when you first started, you worked with health and human services and you kind of had that family aspect and you were able to kind of just meet with families and help them understand sometimes difficult conversations are still those necessary conversations we have to have. And one story that you had shared with me earlier was about, meeting with families that, maybe interracial and that you had to like kind of say like, look, okay, so now you have a Black child. Let's talk about that. And that transparency, I think, is something that is what we're really talking about today is the everyday situations. How do we approach that? And so, Frank, what would you say, for our everyday person who's listening today or maybe attending, what is something you would say, for them, is a way to kind of approach this?
So I'm going to use a word that Kristina started talking about, and what we just you were saying that is prejudices, right? So, but before we even formulate our prejudices, it's stereotypes. And one of the things that that's always going to be present in human nature is in group, out group, figuring out how we align, but also how we differ. And it really starts with stereotypes. So stereotypes can really just be about your mentality when it comes to assumptions based on your lived experiences, right? So it's stereotype, prejudice, then becomes this notion, this idea, discrimination, power, privilege, racism, right? Like I think of it in layers. And as Kristina was talking about, there are layers that are already beneath. And so I'll share with you all is that, yeah, with Health and Human Services, it was interesting because it's a public entity. So you think about residential treatment centers, health, anything in that public setting. It also is a domain where adult protective services resides, child protective services, and there is no law that prevents if you had to, at least geographically where I'm at, if you had to displace somebody temporarily or even long term, there's nothing that says I absolutely have to align you with the same race, ethnicity, identity, racial ethnic identity. Nothing. So automatically you're forcing the collide of lived experiences. And you would have people surface, and I think that's what we're talking about. It's difficult conversation. You would have people call and say, hey, I don't, it's a lot of hesitation. Hey, and that's just my person. I was like, what's the hesitation? What's going on? Oh, you never had a black child in your home? You never had a Hispanic child in your home? You never had an Asian child in your home? You've never had somebody who has a disability? You never had somebody with different sexual identity? They are literally that only person. Think about you traveling 10, 20, 30 miles away from where you live. Already that's different. Can you imagine then a different state or a different country?
Sure.
Absolutely, right? Those lived experiences are shaped. And where I usually would start is, so tell me where you're at and where you're having difficulty so I can help. And when you think about conflict in general, conflict has such a negative kind of feeling to it. But the way I look at conflict is if we can't surface problems, then you're never really going to solve for it. That's all surface level talk. So surface what's bothering you, and let's integrate our ideas together so we come up with a common solution, because the common solution or the common goal is the betterment for someone else or something else, right? Usually, hopefully, someone else. And if I think about that person in mind, that's how we can get to the difficulty. And then I would have people open up and say, "Oh, okay, I'm glad that you brought that up. I don't know how to approach this situation, right? Okay,
Right.
then let's talk that through. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I love how you put that, because I think a lot of times in these different situation and environments, that's part of the fear, is we're afraid that we're going to say the wrong thing, right? Because if you haven't lived that experience, you're really nervous about navigating that
Mhm.
space because you haven't been there before. And so I'll bring that over to Christina. Have you had that experience, in your work? Is that fear of dealing with people and that fear?
You have no idea. We hear it all the time. I was had a client, a potential client reach out to me. This was a all white philanthropic group in the state of Washington. And they had decided what they do is each person, each woman who was a part of this organization contributed, like, I don't know, I think it was like $1,000 a year. And at the end of the year, they would do a promotional pitch for a charity that they wanted to, or nonprofit that they wanted all of this money to be divided between three different groups. And they realized after the death of George Floyd that they really needed to diversify their group. And so they came to us and they said, we'd like for you to tell us how we can invite women, Black women, into our group. And I said, just invite them. Like, what do you mean? Just invite them into your group. And they said, but we don't have any other Black women in our group. And so I said, okay, so tell them that you realize that you want to diversify and invite them into the group. And they would not accept that. They wanted my team and I to write out a script of exactly what they should say, because they were so afraid they were going to say the wrong thing. We wrote out 2 different scripts, and they literally wanted to memorize. And I thought, oh my God, this is so othering. It's so unnecessary. Why treat these people any differently? They're human beings. And seriously, as Black and brown people, we are so used to knowing that people don't have the same lived experiences that we have. And so it's like, in most cases, it's like, okay, all right, so you haven't thought of it before, you're thinking about it now. Okay, either I want in or I don't. But they literally got on a Zoom call with us and absolutely wanted to practice saying the script. And I thought, I am through. Just, if we can just learn to treat people as human beings. And, I think we were talking earlier about the fact that people are going to make mistakes. This field is evolving. When I was growing up, the only word that I used to hear about transgender people was somebody cross-dressing. That's not an appropriate term today, but that's what I heard when I was growing up. And so every day, what was appropriate or acceptable, 10, 15 years ago is not acceptable today. What's acceptable today in some arenas is not going to be acceptable a year from now. So we just have to grow up, and we just have to literally learn as we go. When we make mistakes, we got to stop, and there are things we can do around that. But yeah, it's just it's
Right. No,
fascinating to me. Yeah.
absolutely. I appreciate that. I like how you're saying, we're kind of learning as we go, but we're evolving, right? I mean, what worked before isn't going to work now, and it's not going to work tomorrow, but we have to be willing to try. And so with that, Frank, what would you say, as you're working kind of with leadership, you work with staff, you're doing kind of these intervention groups, what would you say, is something like you've learned that maybe works well, or, you've had to evolve over time, to kind of navigate this space for people, to try and have these difficult conversations?
I think anything can be difficult, especially if you're
Of
thinking
course.
about people. So I think that ahead, as Christine was talking about, we're used to having those conversations. It's also hardwired into our mindset. Very collaborative thinking, especially if you're multilingual. I'm gonna guesstimate that English language is very binary. So if you speak almost any other language, there are a multitude of ways to explain things. So we're already used to culturally and how we're hardwired in our mind to just talk out loud. But in the workforce, there's some difficulty with that. And so one of the easiest ways, and this is going to sound so simple, is that depending on who the person is, I really try to get some connection time with them. Notice I didn't say meeting time, I say connection time. And I'll take whatever I can get. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, optimally an hour. Don't really need to be an hour long. Business has to run, I get that. Optimally about 30 minutes. And I schedule connection time without an agenda. What I am trying to get accomplished, that outcome, is beyond surface level title and roles responsibilities. A big driver of curiosity and inclusion is to figure out what your value system is. Where's your heart? Where's your character? Where's your empathy for others? We all are on a spectrum of empathy. We all are. Even if you argue and say, no, I definitely know somebody who absolutely does not have any empathy whatsoever. They have empathy for themselves. Self-preservation. How do I capture that? And when I've done that, and I've had to evolve around that, because I would always think end in mind, business impact, and let me, it's the ethical thing to do, and I need you to like create this, I need you to do this, I need to take your internal behavior and turn it external, I need external to bring it internal, do all this. Nope, gotta meet them where they're at. So it's, oh, you're the SVP of, you're the VP of, or you're the head of, okay. Hey, I have no agenda right now. I mean, I want to get to know you. So tell me a little bit about yourself. Tell me about your journey, right? Tell me just, and I always, so when you think about authenticity, it's really reflective. So I'll start off, because you can't just say that. And they're like, every business meeting usually has a purpose in mind. And you're having them do something very unnatural, which is bringing the home and heart into the workplace. It's very unnatural. That's not how businesses are run. You do your job and that's it. You're hired to do a particular thing, that's it. Let's be honest, right? So the human element is very much new to the workforce. Even if you go to civil rights, employee resource groups were an initiative by Xerox given to the Black employees to figure out what need to do, right? What are you going to do? But that it's evolved to so much more than that. It's about well-being. It's about inclusion. It's about belonging. This is more than just you need to generate some ideas. So I'll resurface once again. It's really connection time and being very intentional about that. And then before you know it, it becomes a cadence where I'm meeting with certain stakeholders intentionally about every 3 weeks, once a month, whatever they can digest. And you'll see the comments come into you and they'll say, I'm glad that you brought this up. And those leaders are just as frightened as their workforce, believe it or not. And more than just saying the wrong thing, I want to look at common ground and say, their parents, they have disabilities. They come from a wide spectrum of lived experiences. They weren't always in that position. Yes, there are some that generationally, they were literally assigned a position, and it's, you know, they really don't have diverse lived experiences. They're like, I don't know, this is all I know. But those are very far and in between. Most have experienced a lot of stuff. So how do you surface that common ground? And then I kind of bring that empathy onto others. But it takes a lot of intentionality, and it takes a lot of buy-in from your leadership to say, look, I don't have any deliverables just yet. I'm just getting to know the workforce. I'm building a lot of relationships with the strategic leaders, figuring out where their value system is, because that's what's going to drive sustainable change later on. If I don't know who they are as a person, I mean, their role and responsibility, that giving me a budget and giving me some people to work with is not going to go beyond surface level. Right.
Right.
And this has been proven, and if we go empirically based, this is something that's been proven through a number of meta-analysis, that the number one driver is openness and curiosity. But how do you get there in the workforce is go beyond your name and go beyond your roles responsibilities.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned all of that. I mean, one of our guests is also saying, it's D, E, and I is not just a business function, it's a human imperative. So I really like that comment there, agreeing with you. So you mentioned that the necessity for sustainment, based off of leadership. And I'd like to ask, both of you, what have you thought about that, in terms of leadership? Does that just lie on the diversity council's shoulders to kind of take this charge on in an organization, or how do you see that?
I'm going to jump in. No, what I have found to be in the Harvard Business Review a couple of years ago, they said that in order for DEI and B initiatives to be successful, there has to be mentoring, there has to be coaching, there's got to be like several different levers. And I always talk to clients and our team about the fact that when we go in to work with a group, we're pushing many different levers at one time. It is not just the DEIB council, it's not just the leadership, it's all of those. And so right now we're working with one client, and we're working with their diversity council. We're trying to get them trained up so that when we leave, they can continue what we've started with them. We're also working with their leadership team. And then they have a steering committee that is made up of anyone who supervises anyone else. And this is in a healthcare facility. And what we're seeing is that at different times, different levers move faster than the others. So there are times when the task force is really moving, but the leadership team isn't moving as quickly, but then it shifts. So the point is that it's like really trying to churn butter, maybe. It's just like you're churning and you're churning, and at first it's really hard, but then it becomes easier and easier. And I love the way we work with groups, because we're coaching leaders, we're going over some things that we think everyone needs to understand and know. And then we're having facilitated conversations. It's so fun. I'm going to say this really quickly, and then I'm turning it over to Dr. González. We went into one organization after George Floyd, and it's a predominantly white organization. And they said, we want to be the voice of anti-racism in the community. And I said, okay, that's fine, but I need to do my own assessment of your organization first. And when we spoke in small groups with this predominantly white organization, the white folks there were saying, I don't feel safe here. Like, I don't feel like I'm valued here. And so now you're going to go out and be the voice for other people when your own people in your organization don't feel safe and valued. And I told them, you cannot do that yet. I know that's your desire, but right now you got to take care of your own house, get this really solid, and then we can move on. And so we're right at the point now where we've done that. We've done a good job of that, and now we're ready to go into the community. But I was like, no, we're not going there
I like
just
that.
yet.
Right. Yeah,
That's
and that's
amazing.
part of that, when you say DEIB, just for the audience, people that may not know. So we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belongingness now that we're looking at too. That feeling of, safety, belonging, are we included, or do we feel safe here? It's just a whole picture as well for DEI and B. So I'll go ahead and let you add on. Dr. Gonzalez, did you have something
I
to add?
mean, I
Yep.
can't, there, Christina already did the cake and the icing. I mean, all I can add is maybe whatever other little topping sprinkles onto that. I'll come at it both from a research base, but a practicality base too. Okay.
Sure.
I think what resonates with me and what she's speaking is, yeah, you got to have some indexing, right? To figure out what your diverse equity inclusion index is within the employee engagement, a measurement, quantitative measurement. You got to be realistic about the behaviors going on. And last but not least, how the decisions are really made in the workforce. And ultimate decision making on behalf of others is either the share or exclusion of power. It really is. And so when I think about the practicality of that, you layer it, right? So you start off with just the general respect of contributions. And when I think about contributions or professional respect in the workforce is, it is going to be a little bit of your attributes, right? Not necessarily your potential just yet, but who you are as a person, what you've acclimated, and having respect for each other for that, right? Their expertise, their autonomy for that, the empowerment to make decisions for that, right? And it has little to do with the demographics that it is. It's really you, right? If you've been with a company for 5+ years, I should trust your autonomy to make good decisions. I shouldn't make decisions on your behalf. And people do want to be somewhat autonomous and respect that, right? And when I'm figuring out who's who in a workforce, I that part just takes a lot of listening, right? About how people are referred to within the company. And that does come from positional leaders sometimes, or heads of functions. How do you refer to others? Or a better way, here's the practicality is,
Right.
what do you think of this function? And then just throw out a function. What do you think about recruiting? What do you think about talent development? What do you think about the product and people? More of the people. What do you think about the
Right.
people? And listen to how people are referred to, and you'll either see respect or disrespect. You really
Yeah, I
will.
love that.
And you really surface exclusivity. If you can get past that, you generally feel it. Don't trust your intuition. If you really feel like they really this person, this positional leader really generally respects others, they get it. Okay, great. Let's go on to public loyalty or public praise. Public praise is a thing of whether you're in the room or not in the room. When you think about sponsorship within mentorship, right? It's really talking about the potential of someone when they're not in the room and getting them into spaces that they're generally not in. Oh, I think of so-and-so, they're a really great designer. I think of so-and-so, they're a really great facilitator. I think of so-and-so, they're really good at conflict management in the company. You're talking about praise publicly so that their name circulates in areas that it's not accustomed to, right? That's that other phase.
Beautiful.
And if a leader is not willing to do that, that's your area of focus right there. Because that generally, after that respect, that's the step that's usually missing. Because that's a share of power. That's Frank not talking about Frank during the meeting, about all my accomplishments. It's talking about the potential of others and getting them into this space that we're all talking and sharing that those accomplishments and deliverables and don't own them. And that's really very unnatural in the workforce because it's situation, behavior, outcome, or the STAR method: situation, task, right? Result,
Action.
action, result.
Yep.
Is really about
Absolutely.
I. Well, let me tell you, most people don't function as I. We, us, nosotros, us, right? So focusing on that and get them out of that element. But the last piece, when you go from inclusion to belonging, is really about that decision making that I was talking about earlier. Now, I may not impact you as a positional leader, but if you at least facilitate my concerns as a part of these decisions that are being made, again, not for us, without us, that is a true testament of discomfort or comfort and the share of power or the exclusion of people within the workforce. And a real practical way of doing that is just asking, how are decisions made here in your company? If you're interviewing with them, or if you're currently with them, figure out how decisions are made, or when you find out about decisions. If you find out about decisions after they've already been made, go back to professional respect, go back to public praise, figure out where your dysfunction is, or maybe it is your decision making. Decision making after connections and after that environmental, it really comes down to how are decisions made, because you are devaluing my contribution as a human. And again, you're making things that result in my future without me at least bringing to surface those. And I gave you a tip of just, how are decisions made here? Or you can always ask, what was the last employee initiative that was created or is currently in existence here based on employee feedback? Oh, well, no. And if they're only using horizontal examples or vertical examples, then they don't listen to their workforce. And they don't involve their workforce in decision making, and they don't share power. And it's always going to be uncomfortable and not sustainable whatsoever.
Yeah, I love that. That's such a great point about collaborative decision making, really, and the willingness to share in the decision making process. And I think one of our guests also commented on that, and that's really being a lot of an influence in organizations is that willingness to share decision making. And I'm glad you touched on that, Frank. With just a couple more minutes before I turn it over for some audience questions. But I do have a twist I'd like to throw at both of you is with, leadership and us kind of striving to have pioneers and representation in leadership, something I get approached with a lot are these leaders that are kind of pioneers in their industries and in their fields. And, on that coaching aspect and leadership development aspect, and them kind of saying, like, you know what, it is just extremely lonely at the top. And, when they've done so much to get there and they've kind of had to navigate that themselves, what is something, and I think you talked a little bit about this, in the sense of, DEI and B work, but for those pioneers, I mean, what is something that you found to be helpful for them even in kind of starting to have these new conversations and building networks and connection? I know I'm kind of really throwing
Yeah,
a wrench at both of
yeah,
you and
yeah.
making
No,
you
no,
think,
no,
but
no,
I think this is
no,
important, right? We need to talk about that
no.
too.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the clients that we're currently working with, the CEO is retiring at the end of this year. And so we started working with this client maybe a year and a half ago, maybe going on 2 years now. And when we first started, it was just sort of, we need to have these conversations, and we need to see how employees are doing after George Floyd and so on and so forth. But to move the conversation along, I had to ask the CEO, so you're going to retire in December of 2022. What is going to be your legacy? When I framed it that way, it made him stop, because he is so used to, he'd been the leader for 25 years. He'd been the CEO of this organization for 25 years. And when I said to him, what is going to be your legacy? I took him out of the last day of retirement and then into the next 10 or 15 years. Like, what do you need to do? How can we support you? Let's define what your legacy is, number one, and how do we position you? How do we get it there? And so that is what made him decide, I need a a chief diversity officer. We need to invite more people of color into this organization, and not just frontline folks, but as leaders. And so we've been working on a leadership development plan. We've been working on recruiting, and all these different things came out of that one question: what is going to be your legacy? So I was just
Yeah,
really
that's powerful.
happy that that question came up for me to ask him, and that we started putting all these things in place. so that he could leave feeling like I have done my social justice work. I have done my creating a culture of belonging. And so I'm really, really happy that we are there with that particular organization.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. Frank, do you have something you want to add?
That's I wrote that one down. That's
Yeah,
you got to beautify the basics, and that one is well, that one's more than a basic, but definitely what kind of legacy. I would completely agree with that. That's a depending on the positional leader. What kind of legacy do you want to leave here? Is a great open-ended question. I love that. I would say is analogies in leadership are always a thing. Number one, I always if they and I've heard that before. I feel lonely here, or I'm the only one. I don't trust anybody, and I look at them and say, then you've made it. You've made it. In the game of companies, you will absolutely be surrounded by people who have absolutely no intention in helping you unless it's in their self-interest. That's just a realization you have to
sure.
own. And when they and I thank them. Hey, thank you for sharing that. I appreciate your vulnerability with that. It takes a lot of vulnerability to say, I'm all alone here. I don't I can't be myself
Right.
around here. And you're like, wow, your workforce is saying the same thing. But thank you, and I
Right.
appreciate you. And I would say the next one is it's similar, but it's an analogy. And I just say, what kind of car do you want to build? You're like, what? What kind of car do you want to build? CAR. CAR. How have you built the competency and self-efficacy of others? How have you let them be more autonomous? And what I should have said, the R should go first, but I didn't really have another acronym, is the relatedness or the connection.
Sure.
How are you driving that car in this company? And I'll tell you that opens up a lot of conversation. Well, we don't have relationships here. Well, then let's fix that. Well, nobody's allowed to be autonomous and make their own decisions. Again, the dysfunction and sharing of power. Well, competency. You don't have a talent development program. Well, let's fix that. You have, and it's funny, when we say fix, sometimes it's just turning on levers. I'll share a quick story with you. There was a company that I worked with that traditional pipeline or traditional career pathing was only allowed to those that have a bachelor's and master's degree. Christine was talking about the value of education. So only if you had a bachelor's and master's degree could you go into these boot camps and get a lot of certifications that the company already paid for. They had been talking about layoffs, right? About several hundred people were going to be laid off who didn't have some of those credentials. If they had access to them, we could retain them. Okay, so what's the cost going to be to have this set of folks get the same access that this set of folks is? Zero additional costs. This subscription pays for unlimited that the company will pay for. Okay,
Right.
get to that positional leader and tell them you will save all these folks who have a high commitment, high embeddedness to your company if you just allow them to take these courses. And we saved 80% of those folks. Now, some of the other folks left through natural attrition, right? That's what I'm talking about, is just like clever thinking of that competency,
Right.
right? And so what kind of car do you want to build here at this company is a really great analogy to open up the conversation of where they're going.
It's a great acronym for us to remember, right? The competency, autonomy, and relatedness. And then Christina's tip there is, what is your legacy going to be, right, with these leaders in these positions? I do want to give time for our guests. They've been listening in intently. If they have questions. So Sedley is just reminding the guests that their microphones are now enabled. So if you could please raise your hand in the audience if you do have a question, so that we can bounce over to you quickly. And I'll just ask that you can kind of keep your question and comment to about 2 minutes, so that we could make sure that we're able to, get everybody's questions or comments in. So if you do have a question or comment for our guests, we can go ahead and take those now. Um, in the meantime, while I'm waiting for any of those to roll in, and Sedley, if you see one, okay, here's one. So Miss Jessica Bantam has a question. Your hand is raised. I
Thank you,
believe you
Dr.
can
Walker.
Oh, yep. Hi.
And
Go
thank you
ahead.
to the panelists. This was a great conversation. And actually, that last question just made me think about something. And I just kind of wanted to run it by the panelists just for your thoughts. I have talked to leaders about finding an accountability partner, because I think what's really hard for them, you know, especially when you are the leader, the CEO, the top person, whatever, and especially if you are a white male, which is mostly what we're you know, working with in this field, even if they want to be that pioneer, I think it's hard for them to step out like that. So it just occurred to me that maybe as practitioners, we can build communities among our clients even to support each other. So they have that other person, you know, someone else to reach out to, like, all right, this is, you know, this is new territory for me. What are you experiencing? And maybe how can we support each other? So I just want to put that out there and see what your thoughts were about that.
Thank you for that, Jessica. So, do either of you have experience using accountability partners in your work?
I would say, you know, it, and I am going to own my bias. I'm biased. Biased towards being, years back, I was a frontline facilitator, then academy manager in training. And I've kind of gone almost full circle and I do some training now. Yes, I would say yes. And it starts with some sort of, you know, training, clear objectives, where at the end of it, there is a cohort or a learning partner. And I intentionally open like inclusion type leadership trainings, workshops, where the certification is one thing, or doing it, that's not even my end goal. My end goal is, how do I get folks from different functions to collaborate? And then secretly, I do put them together at the end during like the action planning wrap up of a workshop and say, so and so and so and so, great learning partners, you all experience this together. And I do that, vocalizing it. You involve as many senses as possible. You vocalize it. And I've even done, if we can do it in face to face, but even digitally, I have them sign a learning partner agreement. Now you might be thinking, well, what's this all about? Well, it's a psychological contract that I, as this head of function or this person, can have Kristina held accountable, but she can also hold me accountable. And me as the instructor or facilitator, I have now, I accumulate masses of folks that have been in through this experience together. And it really helps humanize that piece of accountability. And it may sound very informal and very loose and very ambiguous, but it really works, because now I get them recommending each other for different projects. I get them surfaced up as recommendations on the D9 Council. I get them as the people that first step up for community partnerships or volunteerism. I get them to really step up in meetings because they built that, not necessarily with me, but with trust factor between each other. They've had very intimate
Nice.
conversations in these trainings. Therefore, they've already exposed a lot of themselves, right? That vulnerability and where their heart really lies. Easy
Great.
transition into the workforce accountability.
So a little bit of peer accountability is built into your training. It's
I love
similar,
that. I love
Kristina?
that. Yeah, I really love that. I think I'm going to have our teams sign the contract. So thank you so much for that. We've
Great.
done it not across companies, but within a company, that we have had accountability partners, and we provide them with a workbook. And what the workbook does is it takes them through guided activities, and they can go as fast or slow. You know, they can take one activity a week and meet with their accountability partner, even if it's for 15 to 30 minutes, and say, we're going to discuss this activity. What was your first experience around race, and tell me the story, and that kind of thing. Or an identity wheel, here's how I identify in terms of many different components. And so it's a really hefty workbook. It's got like 50 pages of activities that they do with
Wow.
their partner, number one. And then with another organization, they wanted us to facilitate reading. So you want to talk about race. And so we would talk about it in our discussion meetings, number one, but then they also had a partner and they had some questions that they had to answer from the chapters that we read, but that they had to talk with one other person one-on-one. And that worked out really, really, really well. People really do like that.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. As far as being able to do self-awareness, I think with each uh, element of your training is very important. Well, it looks like we have another question from Emily Drury. I'm not sure if I'm getting, yeah, Drury. I'm not sure.
You
Do
got
you
it.
want to go ahead and, okay, go ahead and unmute. Hi,
Thank
welcome.
you so much. Yes, so in a lot of what I'm hearing from you all, and in talking about difficult conversations, I'm hearing about trust, I'm hearing about being the only one, I'm hearing about sharing power. Um, in my experience, a lot of the folks that are in power right now, carriers of power, you know, a lot of us also grew up with adages like never let them see you sweat. And there's this fear that your credibility is at risk. It's really, really hard to be wrong and to go into the territory of other and different. You are amping up the risk of making a mistake. And I've found in my own, my own life and plenty of leaders that I work with too, there's not necessarily a lot of life experience that has given to resiliency. And so, how are you encouraging folks to step out, use that vulnerability, which there may not be a whole lot of practice with that, to take a risk and to let them know your credibility isn't at stake here? How are you doing that with folks?
Emily, that is
Okay.
such a really good question. And you're right. It has to be really orchestrated, I think, very carefully. And what I have found with the accountability partners, that CEO who might be sitting on the diversity council, who might be, coming to the larger group activities, number one, may not say anything in that group, but with their accountability partner, they will open up and have a conversation, and they'll be much more vulnerable there than they will in front of the larger group. That's been my experience. And there was another thought that the other thing is, I saw in the chat that Sin Yi pointed out the fact that, yes, people want diversity work done until they realize it's about them doing the work and it's about sharing power. And then it becomes, they become very defensive in some cases, very defensive. No, I want you, D&I strategist Kristina Smith, come in and fix the problem. And so that can be really a challenge depending on, where these folks are, where these leaders are, what is their what's their lived experience, what's their exposure. Really, really difficult when I'm working in the upper Midwest in Portland, Oregon, and other states where people grow up in all white families, go to all white schools, go to colleges that are all white, and even are working in all white companies. Um, that group of people is even more stressed because they feel like they've had no exposure along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. Frank, did you want to comment on that? I have something to add if you
Yeah.
want.
Well, hello, my friend Emily. How are you?
Hello,
Great to
hello.
see
So
you
glad to
here.
be
I
here.
know.
Yeah.
So great to see you. Thank you for being in the space. Well, maybe this will be a good segue, Dr. Walker, but you as a background in IO, and one of my
Right.
domain expertise was personality five-factor model. I
Yeah.
combine followership, personality in outgroup in my research, but Emily, one thing you said is, really a lot of positional leaders in corporate definitely are high on conscientious, very high on order. So anything that is outside of their comfort zone, anything, not to mention human element, that's very hard to measure unless you have a good curator of that, will give them a lot of anxiety. And they won't tell you that. The fear factor is worry because, like, what are you going to say? What do you do? And especially if they're in an HR function, oh gosh, that goes off the roof. So what I usually do is show them past success of something, of allowing something to have been done that was still successful and not showing a polished look. And if I don't have an example, then I'll take the lead on it. And I'll share with you a quick story is that we would do town halls and in a recent company, right? That, town halls, like board meetings, everything, you just get polished, polished, polished. 50 slides down to 5 slides, down to 5 minutes, down to 5 seconds, and you just like polish, polish, polish. You say everything precisely, bottom line up front, da 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 da. No icebreakers, nothing. Just get right to the point. I said, we need to try something different. This surface level stuff that I was telling you about, I'll take the next one. And I did a group activity. I said, I need more time. I said, give me at least 15 minutes. I said, the first 5 minutes, I'll do a group activity, right? Just a team builder, and then we'll get into the subjects. There's plenty of time for that. Here's the trick though. I measured it. Always measure and get feedback. And so they were also not used to that. And I prep people ahead of time. I said, we're going to get an evaluation of, with a 1 to 5, kind of the Kirkpatrick model of, reaction. But I also want, did you still accomplish business impact? Absolutely. Did you still gather, get on the objectives? Absolutely. And there was a lot of commentary on there that I had to share with a positional leader. I said, look, they're okay with everything not being so polished. So can we try other stuff that's not so polished? Because what ends up happening is you're shooting down creativity. And are we running out of ideas here? Yes, yes. Okay, didn't we get accomplished? Yes. Okay, great. So that's just a fun way of approaching that power struggle sometimes of like, I want everything so polished and say the exact same things. And really it's because they have maybe bad history with each other. And I get that, but I can't fix everybody's personal relationships. I can just try to create an atmosphere where it's okay to just be yourself a little bit, So what do you think, Dr. Walker? I know
Oh
you
no, I
said you had some
appreciate
stuff.
that story. And of course, I always love when we measure things, right? Because we have to measure it if we're going to make change happen. So, well, the thing I heard Emily say really was just, how do you take that risk to your credibility by being vulnerable? And I think really you did touch on that, both of you, is just, being able to still have that accountability and calling people to the carpet, but also being able to speak about lived experiences that are applicable to the work that you do, right? So, how does it affect performance with the people that you work with, and also showing them how it applies to them personally? Because if it doesn't really resonate with you personally, you're not going to actually hear the message. And I found that in my life, because things that you hear every day, it doesn't really hit home per se until it's something like you've dealt with, maybe like a death or somebody robbing your home. Then all of a sudden you really pay attention to like things you hear in the news about, theft and things like that. So I'm just saying that as an example, is if you can really make it personal in those experiences with the people that you're dealing with and show how it does affect the performance, that a lot of times that will help with the credibility. I know we're getting close on time here, and I do want to address, there's one question here in the chat. Again, just on measuring results, what suggestions might we have on terms of moving away from how happy are our clients with the workshop? Okay, that's more for Sedley, but I'll let Sedley maybe deal with that. But I do want to just say we are recording this, so if you want to catch it offline, you can. And I want to thank each one of our guests. They can find each one of you on LinkedIn, of course. I don't know if Dr. Noe, you want to leave any parting words for us from SDIG. It's been a pleasure with each and every one of you today, sharing in us and talking about these difficult conversations. So Dr. Noe, do you have a parting words? You're on mute though, if you will just come off mute quickly. Dr. Noe?
Sorry. I just want to say a special thank you to all of you. I think this is so amazing. I listened very attentively, whether it's going to the question Christiana asked about your legacy. And that's essentially what I was discussing with the one chief that is still here. What do leaders consider their legacies to be, especially those that lead these countries that are so rich, yet people are struggling? Then that brings me to Dr. González, his comments about connection. You know, sometimes when I look, it seems as though we have walls that divide people. And all of a sudden, we expect people to just come in and forget about the walls, forget about the misconceptions that had been developed in layers against one another. That's why I'm so appreciative of the type of ideas and the way you guys expressed it. And all I can say is that we want to see you guys more often than it has taken us to see you this time. Thank you. And back to you,
Okay.
Karen, and thank you for all the things you guys did.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much. I think that's all that we had time for today. So I will go ahead and let us close out if Dudley has final parting words. But thank you all for your time and appreciate everything today and our fine guests. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Walker. This is the SDIG studio in London, and thanking our guests, Ms. Kristina Smith, Dr. Frank González, and also our moderator, Dr. Karen Walker, whose details you can find if you drop into our website at systemicdiversity.org, or if you'd like to bookmark our live brochure, systemicdiversity.us/brochure, where you will be able to shortly find in our YouTube channel a copy of this event and conversation. Would like to thank all of you for joining us today very much indeed. And as we often do, leaving you not only with our links, but if you'd like to stay with us for a few minutes after our recording is finished, then do feel free, because in the meantime, as we very often try to do, leaving you with a little bit of Bob Marley and the Wailers from SDIG in London and in the US. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.